Hello and welcome to this HESES22 training video. My name is Roger Lear and I am a funding officer here at the Office for Students. This video is particularly aimed at those new to or perhaps returning to HESES and will provide an introduction to what's involved in the submission and verification of the HESES22 workbook. This video is the last of a series of recordings and live webinars that we are presenting on HESES22. For further information on all of these, including recordings of the live events and access to the slides presented, please consult the OFS events page at www.officeforstudents.org.uk/events. We have produced a number of supporting documents to help providers who will be completing the HESES data survey, most of which can be accessed through the main HESES page on our website, which is at www.officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES. In particular, you should make sure that you consult the HESES22 guidance, which can be found in the publications sections of the website at www.officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES22. This document sets out the rules and definitions that you will need to use when returning your HESES data. If you're new to HESES, we have also produced a how-to publication called Completing the HESES22 Workbook, which provides more of a beginner's guide to completing the workbook. We have also made a number of shorter topic-based videos on YouTube, which you may find useful. Go to youtube.com/officeforstudents. For a more general view of OFS funding, we will also be publishing our Guide to Funding 2022-23, which will be available in October from the OFS website. Lastly, if you want to stay informed about OFS announcements, including those relating to funding, you can sign up for our email alert service. Information on how to do this can be found at www.officeforstudents.org.uk/sign up for email alerts, with that last part all being hyphenated. So let's look at what we're covering today. First of all, how to submit your HESES22 workbook. That is, how to upload your completed workbook as your HESES submission on the OFS portal. Next, how the OFS will carry out data verification on your HESES22 return. As part of this, we'll also look at how you can help to streamline the data verification process for both you and for the Office for Students. Finally, how to get your HESES22 submission signed off. This is what we're all aiming for, so this is perhaps the most important part of the whole process. So let's start by looking at the submission of your HESES workbook. And we'll set the scene by looking at where this comes in the HESES timeline. As you can see from this table, the workbooks will be available to download from the OFS portal in late October. You can also see the census dates, and this census date concept is something we talked about in our second live webinar, and you can see that this is either the 1st of November or the 1st of December according to the type of provider involved. In terms of submitting your workbook and what happens after that, you need to know the deadline dates for workbook submission. And you can see from the slide that these are noon on the 10th of November for further education and sixth form colleges and academies, and noon on the 12th of December for all other providers. We do not allow extensions to the submission deadline, so please make sure that you submit before the deadline. If necessary, changes can be made before sign-off during the data verification process. And as you can see, submitting your workbook is not the end of the process. HESES data verification is the second part of this presentation, and it carries on until the sign-off deadline, which this year is on the 30th of January 2023, by which time we expect that all HESES returns will be signed off. We'll look at that process at the end of this session. Submitting the HESES workbook is done via the OFS portal. Why? Because it is a secure and controlled method of sending and receiving workbooks. Please do not send HESES workbooks by email. Aside from the fact that email is not a wholly reliable medium, especially with attachments, its security is not good. For providers that must fill in the courses table, certain circumstances could conceivably lead to individual students being identified, For this and other reasons, it's better that everyone uses the same most secure method of transfer, the IFS portal. If you find that you need to send us any additional information that could be sensitive, please contact us and we will be able to arrange a secure method of transferring the information. You can access the portal at https://extranet.officeforstudents.org.uk/data. In this session, we'll only touch on the portal's use, but for chapter and verse, we have other resources. You can reach each of these from our website at www.officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES, and there you can find a video that deals with the mechanics of using the IFS portal for HESES. And this can also be found on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/officeforstudents. And you can also find Appendix 1 of the Completing the HESES22 workbook document, which spells it all out. It's called Downloading and Submitting HESES22. These resources have all the detail, but we'll spend a few moments just touching on some important points, which will also help you in terms of downloading the workbook too. If submitting your HESES return will be the first time that you're accessing the IFS portal, you'll need to make sure that you're a registered portal user at your provider. Once registered and assigned to the HESES22 survey area, you'll be able to navigate to that point to upload your HESES22 workbook. If you're not registered, you'll need to ask the portal administrator at your provider to create an account for you and to assign you to the HESES22 survey area. If you're unsure about who your user administrator is, but you are a registered portal user, you can view the portal administrators at your provider by logging into the portal. Otherwise, if you can't log in and you don't know who the administrators are, please contact us at portal@officeforstudents.org.uk. Both the video and the document that I referred to on the previous slide describe the steps in more detail, so refer to those if you need to. In terms of submitting the workbook, I won't spend a long time on how to use the portal for this because of the more detailed resources that I've already mentioned. The video on our website and YouTube channel, and Appendix 1 to the Completing the HESES22 workbook document. So this is more of an overview. To start the upload, navigate to the correct area on the portal and click on Upload, and you will be prompted to locate your file and set the process in motion. It's worth saying that this is a single thread process on the portal, so you may have to wait in the queue, but you can log off and return later if you wish without losing your place in the queue. Also note that on deadline day, waits can be fairly long, so please don't leave things until the last minute if you can avoid it. When it comes to amending the workbook, you can, if you wish, upload your workbook before the census date, but any submissions before then are invalid. After the census date, you can upload as many times as you wish, and we will always take the latest upload as the one to be used for data verification. If you have managed to modify the workbook in some way, your workbook will not be accepted, but hopefully this shouldn't occur as we have protected all the relevant areas. When the upload is complete, check the Outcome and Comments fields. Refer to Appendix 1 of Completing the HESES22 workbook for guidance if needed. If there are errors in the workbook, it will not be accepted and you'll have to correct this before it will be accepted as a valid submission. After submission, click on Results to download what's referred to as the results package, which is a zip file. We'll look at this in a moment. Remember, only the person that uploaded the workbook can download the results package, so please ensure that it's stored in a safe place that's available to all those that need access to it. Please see our website and our YouTube channel for our video on this process, and it's all described in Appendix 1 to the Completing the HESES22 workbook document, and as noted, you can find these at officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES. The results package zip file contains a version of your workbook with your submitted data and automatic highlighting applied to some of the tables. You'll find that some information will have been added or amended on the information page. We'll see this in a moment, but basically we add the submission date and a submission number. This workbook from the results package will be the one that we use for data verification, so you should download the results package to a safe place accessible to all that are likely to need it, and use a copy of this for any revisions that may prove necessary. Remember, only the person that made the upload to the portal can download the results package, and in any case it's a good idea to have more than one person working on HESES so that there are no single points of dependency. This is particularly important in the present difficult times, and also because data verification takes place over the holiday period, so make sure that any of your colleagues that need access to this file have it. This is the top part of the information tab in the workbook, and you can see that useful submission information that I was just describing, namely the submission date and the submission number. These get filled in after each submission to the portal. Underneath these you will see the workbook checks shown here. You should check the information in this section before submitting your workbook. They summarise issues or potential issues with the data in the workbook. You can see that these are classified as validation checks, and we'll come on to these in just a moment, credibility checks and comparison table highlighting. I'll come on to these later as they indicate places where we are likely to ask data verification questions. Here's the bottom half of the information tab. I want to show this to you so that you can see the notes and guidance, and below that we'll see the particular version of the workbook template that's being used and any notes relating to the latest changes. Let's go back and focus on the validation checks that I mentioned a moment ago. You shouldn't be attempting to submit a workbook that has validation errors, but if validation errors are present in a submitted workbook, the results package workbook will have an extra sheet in it called validation, which will detail the specific problems. Validation errors will also be flagged in the tables in which they occur, with the relevant values turning red and validation failure appearing above the column. While your workbook can still be submitted if it's invalid, we will not accept it as a valid submission. The errors that are being triggered must be resolved before the workbook will be accepted as a valid submission. Let's see an example. Remember, validation errors occur where data is not feasible, rather than it just being unlikely. In this example, a negative number has been entered in a workbook cell that cannot be negative. Entries in column 2 cannot have a negative count of years of instance. As you can see here, this will be highlighted in red on the workbook itself, above the appropriate column, below or to the side of the table in question, and as shown previously, the presence of validation errors will also be shown on the information tab. Once errors have been resolved, the amended workbook should be resubmitted to the portal and the new version of the results package should be downloaded, so that we see this reflected in the information sheet with the message "No validation errors." Okay. Having looked at how to submit your workbook, in a moment we'll look at what happens as we go into data verification. After the submission deadline passes, we move on to the data verification itself. Once we have received the uploaded data, we will start to examine it to determine if any queries need to be asked about it. Practically all providers receive queries on their data. It's an iterative process with multiple rounds of queries. Each provider will work with our data verification team, and in our first round of queries, we will email each provider's student data contact with a letter with full instructions on the data verification process and a data verification queries or DVQ document which lists our specific queries. There'll also be a deadline specified for receiving your responses, which is also, at least in the early stages of the data verification process, 5 working days away. I'll show you an example of the data verification queries template shortly, and we'll look at how to respond to queries later. Naturally, we expect providers to follow best practice when compiling and submitting data, because this is used to determine funding as well as for other planning purposes. And for these reasons, it's also important for us to use a robust data assurance process. So data verification is the first step that we take to ensure that the data supplied to us is fit for purpose. Other activities such as audits and/or data reconciliations may take place at a later date. For now, we're focusing on the data verification process. It's important to note that where a provider fails to submit data on time or returns data that is not credible after verification, we may allocate funds based on our own estimates of student activity. We reserve the right to use our own estimates of data where we have reason to believe provider data is not fit for purpose. We reserve the right to review funding allocations for the most recent 7-year period. What we're looking for when it comes to HESES is the best possible representation of your higher education provision. This allows us to make accurate grant allocations. Data verification allows us to be confident in the accuracy of your data, to be confident in the robustness of your data processes, to identify any large or unexpected changes compared to previous years, and to understand the context of your data, how HESES relates to what's happening with your provision. Notice that it's common for us to ask queries of most or all providers. It's our first step in the due diligence process. As just mentioned, things like data reconciliation and audit may follow. It benefits us for all of these reasons, and hopefully as providers you will find the exercise useful also, because it should give you an opportunity to think about how your provision is changing. We base our queries primarily on first stage credibility warnings and comparison table highlighting. First stage credibility warnings may occur where the data in the workbook is possible but seems unlikely or unusual. We'll look at an example in a moment. Comparison table highlighting. Comparison tables were mentioned earlier, but we haven't said much about them so far. They're not something that you enter data into, but they're automatically filled in, and we'll talk about the highlighting on them in a moment. For now, we'll just say that this is where we find greater than expected changes in data compared to previous years and from other sources. As noted before, these are also listed on the information sheet. We may base queries on other relevant issues as well. These won't necessarily be highlighted in your workbook, but might be things which come to our attention. Some of them might actually come to light during the data verification process. It's important to know that by asking these data verification queries, it doesn't signify that we think that the data is wrong, it's just that it's unexpected. If changes are large, we would expect a more detailed explanation for the differences. Just to give you an idea of what we're discussing here, let's look at credibility warnings and comparison table highlighting a little more closely. First, let's look at first stage credibility warnings, which occur when data is possible but appears unusual. Again, this is not necessarily saying that there's anything wrong with the data or that it's considered incorrect. Rather, that based on the data that we have available to us, the data differs from what we might expect. As an example, consider a workbook where all students are recorded as new entrants on Table 5. This may be accurate for a new provider, but for most it's not what we would normally expect to see. Credibility warnings will be highlighted above the relevant column and below the table. Workbooks with credibility warnings will be accepted as submissions, but these will almost certainly be queried during the data verification process, so you should investigate the underlying causes. Submission of what we call initial explanations can help to speed up the verification process. More on this in a moment. Next, the comparison tables. These appear towards the end of the HESES workbook. Their contents are automatically generated from the data entered into it and from other sources for individualized data. Because there are several variants of these tables, it's not worth giving a specific example of highlighting in them, but you will probably notice these when you're preparing your workbook for submission. This is just an illustration of the type of thing that you might see. The point to remember here is that this type of highlighting appears if comparisons made in these tables extend beyond predefined thresholds, All of the parameters and thresholds used for these tests are outlined in the appendices to the Completing the HESES22 workbook document that we referred to earlier. Again, this does not necessarily signal that there's anything wrong with the data or that it's considered incorrect. It's just not what we might expect given what we know. A workbook with comparison table highlighting is valid for submission, but it's likely that the highlighted fields will be queried in the data verification process. So, before uploading to the portal, please check the reasons for the highlighting, and if possible detail these by submitting initial explanations to dataverification@HESES22.org.uk. Don't worry if you have lots of highlighting. If your data is accurate, we won't be querying every single bit of highlighting. Lots of the highlights will be related, and if you can point this out to us in your initial explanations, that will help. Focusing now on the data verification queries, these are held in a document that you may hear referred to as the DVQ template. It's a Microsoft Word document that contains all the detail of the queries and the provider responses, and it's exchanged by email between the data verifier and the person that each provider has nominated as their student data contact throughout the verification process. We strongly recommend that each provider nominate more than one student data contact if possible to avoid single points of dependence due to holidays or unscheduled absence. Please write to HESES, that's HESES, at officestudents.org.uk to nominate other colleagues in this role. Remember to get your local user administrator to also set them up on the OFS portal. And as we've said before, it's a good idea to save your workbooks and correspondence where other team members can access these if required, as only those who upload the workbook can download the results package. These factors are particularly important because of the tight timetable for data verification. Now we'll look at an example of the format of the DVQs and how they are built up through the data verification process. This slide will give you an idea of the back and forward of the data verification process. Here's just one page from the Word document that I've been describing that's exchanged between the data verifier and the student data contact throughout the verification process. We don't show it here, but it starts with a section for queries on first stage credibility warnings. Its format is almost identical to what we see here from the following section for queries on the workbook's comparison tables. Specifically, here we see questions on comparison table H, which is about the proportions of new entrants on table 5. We won't show the comparison table itself here or the highlighting on it because we just want to show the format of the data verification queries. Under the heading Table Row, the relevant place on the table is identified, in this case the row for full-time and sandwich year out home fee undergraduates. In the next column, headed Query, we see the reason for the highlighting and then the data verifier's request for further details. Note that the queries are dated. Please date your own responses in the adjoining column for ease of reference. To further assist with this, if there's more than one exchange of queries and responses, data verifiers will often colour the text of their queries to help distinguish them from each other. It's helpful if this is mirrored in the provider responses. Finally, once a query has been successfully answered, the entire row will be shaded grey to show that it has been completed. The most frequently asked data verification queries focus on things like changes in the proportion of students by, say, price group, mode of study and fundability status, and changes in non-completion rates. We also might ask, how has your provision changed? In terms of responses to data verification queries, we're looking for responses that directly relate to the query raised, and you can cross-reference your responses if that is appropriate. We're also looking for a level of detail that's appropriate and that show an understanding of the HESES definitions. Before sending back your responses, please check that you have responded to all of the data verification queries raised. It often happens that the data verification process highlights the need to make changes to your workbook. And if this is the case for you, in the first instance, please contact your data verifier who will assist you. We'll talk more about this on the next slide. Email your responses to dataVerification@officeforstudents.org.uk. Please respond within the deadline set when the data verification queries were sent to you. Initially, this will be 5 working days, but as the data verification process continues, because several rounds of queries may be needed as the sign-off deadline approaches, tighter deadlines may be stipulated. I've mentioned initial explanations a couple of times now, so let me describe them more fully. They are preemptive responses to data verification queries that you can email to us once you've made your final workbook submission. A quick example might be a provider planning to take an extra intake of students in January. The resulting increase in the number of new entrants on Table 5 may trigger a credibility warning. That same increase may also mean that thresholds for differences between values on various comparison tables are exceeded, resulting in one or more fields being highlighted. Initial explanations are not mandatory, but using them to address any first stage credibility warnings and comparison table highlighting at an early stage can speed up the data verification process. They effectively become the first round of data verification queries. An email identifying the factors lying behind these issues can be sent as initial explanations to dataVerification@officeforstudents.org.uk as soon as you've submitted your final workbook submission. There's no predefined format for these, but please refer clearly to the relevant part of the workbook. Getting the sign-off of your data is what we have been aiming for throughout this process, and it's worth re-emphasising the importance of this because it represents the data that will be used in calculating the grant allocations for the next academic year, which are published in the spring or early summer. The HESES sign-off form is sent when our queries have been resolved and any amendments to the data in the workbook have been processed. It shows a submission number and date from the information sheet of the workbook, and it's very important that you check that the submission date and number shown on the form tie up with your most recent submission to the portal. This is what connects the sign-off to your workbook and its data. It must be signed and returned by the final sign-off deadline, which for HESES22 is the 30th of January 2023. The sign-off must be by the provider's accountable officer. If it's anticipated that they will not be available, then do please let us know as soon as possible. Additionally, if there is an expected change in the accountable officer, something that often takes place at the start of a new calendar year, please make us aware so that we can prepare the sign-off form accordingly. We expect that the data we use will be the final version submitted and signed off as correct by the provider's accountable officer. Sometimes errors are identified in the data after it has been signed off, or even after the OFS has used the data. Signed off data can be amended, but we will only accept amendments to final submitted data in exceptional circumstances. To be accepted for amendment, errors must be widespread and significant, relate to clear evidence of data error rather than reinterpretation of the data, and be likely to have a material impact on one or more of our uses of the data. A data amendment panel will assess errors using information provided to them and then decide or recommend whether we require the errors to be corrected. If you believe that your data may need to be amended after sign-off, please contact us straight away. For further details, please see our website at this address, www.officeforstudents.org.uk/data and analysis/amendments to data. And just to reread that again, everything after the org.uk is hyphenated, so it's officeforstudents.org.uk/data-analysis/amendments-to-data. So let's look at what we've covered in this recording. We've looked at how to submit your HESES22 workbook, how to upload your completed workbook as your HESES submission on the OFS portal. We've looked at how the OFS will carry out data verification on your HESES return. As part of this, we looked at how you can help to streamline the data verification process both for you and for the OFS. And we've looked at how to get your HESES22 submission signed off. This brings us to the end of this recording about the submission and data verification of the HESES22 workbook. If you want to find out more about HESES, there are a number of sources available which can be accessed from our main HESES webpage at www.officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES. In particular, we would recommend that you download a copy of the main HESES22 guidance document from www.officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES22. And you may also wish to access some of the other training materials we've produced. If you have any questions, we're always happy to help. Please email HESES, that's HESES, at officeforstudents.org.uk. Thank you for listening.